And of course, I know we can only speculate because the sources aren't necessarily complete, but the relationship between Elizabeth and her mother at this stage, it doesn't seem to be. I mean, they're in contact, and even after Elizabeth leaves court, she's not. She doesn't cut off ties with her, but they don't seem to be particularly close. She doesn't seem to model herself on her mother and her mother's style.
Well, she definitely doesn't model
No,
herself on her mother.
no, and it doesn't appear that they are especially close later on. They are in contact. She's not Elizabeth Woodville isn't cut off completely, but it seems far from a close relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with you. I mean, I think we don't know, and we may just it may just be the impression that we get, and it may be. I mean, of course, why does Elizabeth Woodville get cut off? Well, it's so that the king can give her money to his wife. So, because the first year or so of Elizabeth's queenship, she doesn't have a proper entitlement, and she can't really because her mother's got it. And as we know, Henry was famously fiscally conservative, shall we say. So whether there was even any resentment that Elizabeth, the older Elizabeth, felt the younger had taken, we just don't know. I mean, Elizabeth probably had no choice in any of these decisions. And it doesn't seem like she doesn't seem to have played any real political role at all as queen. And we just do not know whether that's because she wasn't allowed to, or she didn't want to, or both. But it was probably a sensible decision. But I guess the only thing I'd say is she's not a passive figure, despite all of that. As I say, it's her going to her husband after Arthur's death saying, we can do this. We can have another go. We can keep this dream alive. And again, looking at the negotiations, which obviously I studied in detail around Arthur's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, they use Elizabeth. She's a secret weapon. She's brought out to charm the ambassadors when they're unsure about England and win them over. And she stages a mock quarrel with her husband about which one of them gets to keep the letters from the Spanish king and queen, letters they couldn't even read. They're a very well-oiled partnership, and Elizabeth's active in it. It's not this, I'm just in the background having no say and being silenced.
Yeah. And I suppose on the issue of Elizabeth Woodville, I suppose as well, if you have a queen consort and you also have the king's mother, a queen dowager is, it's another expense, but it's also another figure. It's perhaps one too many. And I'm not suggesting that either Elizabeth nor her mother-in-law deliberately plotted to get rid of her necessarily, but I think you've already got enough female leaders at court without her as well. And she was also she was always a divisive figure even during her husband's time as well.
You've still got Cecily, Duchess of York around, don't forget, for the early part of the reign.
Yes.
And she's not doing a lot. But what I thought was quite interesting when I was going through the records in quite a bit of detail when I was writing my book, and I think the 3 times in the first 18 months of the king's reign, he has to intervene to protect Cecily's landed Cecily, Duchess of York's landed interest, and he's obviously happy to do that. But he will have known from his mother and from his uncle and from others that Henry VI's kingship, who they all revered as a saint, but revering him as a saint was probably a clever way of not drawing attention to his qualities as a king. But one of the big problems with his regime is how much patronage and land and wealth had flown to the center and around a few cronies close to the royal family. Now, I'm not saying that's what motivated him to think and be fiscally prudent with members of his wife's family, but I suspect he did rightly recognize that monarchy needed to be solvent and efficient for some of those reasons, and lots of hangers-on in the royal family certainly didn't help matters.
No, I mean that would certainly have complicated things, and certainly there are too many competing voices for the king's attention, and for prominence and preeminence at court, and so having a slimmed down monarchy, which we hear a lot of at the moment, it does have its advantages in terms of not only does it mean that you can have that fiscal prudence, but it also means that there are not too many people competing either for the king's ear nor for popularity among not just the commons, but I mean even just among the nobility. You're not. But then again, I suppose the risk is, as we were saying earlier, that the fewer leading members of the royal family, leading members at court, means that there are then fewer positions for those members of the aristocracy, and then you get the disaffected members of the aristocracy who become slightly less loyal. I'm not saying that they would necessarily want to stage rebellions or anything like that, but they're not at court regularly, they're not necessarily involved in court ceremony, court ritual, so they become more disaffected, a bit more disinterested in all of that. So they're not then. So then during the bad times, they're not necessarily there for you to call on their loyalty and their support. So it is a fine balancing act.
Well, I think that's quite an important point, because I think it becomes quite clear to Henry quite early on that Elizabeth Woodville is someone he can get rid of without causing much grief. She doesn't seem to have supporters, and historians have different views on this, but the earliest accounts of her banishment suggest it was at the insistence or the request of senior people near Henry, and it doesn't come from him. As we were saying earlier, it's quite easy to get people to request you to do something you want to do. And there might be a bit of that in it, but obviously Elizabeth Woodville had always been unpopular. Arguably, she made herself very unpopular with former Edward IV supporters when she didn't have a choice, but she sort of united with Richard III after the first rebellion, Buckingham's rebellion, flops, and arguably some never forgive her for that. And it's sort of a popular thing to do to get rid of Elizabeth Woodville. It's quite hard to know whether that's true, but it's certainly a credible interpretation of the events of 1487. And so, yes, then that creates more space for other people to be able to do other things. Of course, because Elizabeth dies in 1491, which is quite relatively soon after, we don't really know what her longer term role would have been at court. It's quite hard to say.
Yeah, it is. But I suppose it is fair to say that her support had mainly been among her family and her older supporters anyway. She wasn't necessarily as widely, didn't have the support among the wider nobility that we see in other members of the family.
I've never done a huge study on Elizabeth Woodville's personal affinity, but I think that's true. I think any support she had would have been captured by Elizabeth of York at any rate, and she probably didn't bring an awful lot more to the political table in that sense.